The morning light spilled softly through the tall windows of the city's grand music conservatory. The halls were lined with portraits of famous pianists, violinists, and composers who once shaped the world of music. Inside, students rushed about, carrying sheet music and instruments, their voices filled with youthful excitement. Amid this world of polished shoes and refined sounds, there was one person who moved quietly, almost unseen: Lena, the janitor. Every morning before sunrise, she arrived with her small cart, a mop, and a gentle smile that few noticed. She wore a faded uniform, her hair tied back neatly, and her steps were light, as if she didn't want to disturb the silence that hung in those grand halls. To most people, she was just part of the background, someone who made sure the floors shined. The trash bins stayed empty, and the classrooms smelled clean. But behind her calm eyes and tired hands, there was something more, something few could guess. While others walked past her, she noticed everything: the rhythm of footsteps, the echo of laughter, and most of all, the sound of the piano drifting from practice rooms. Whenever she heard those notes, her heart seemed to pause for a moment, as if it remembered something it had long forgotten. Late at night, when everyone had gone home, Lena would often stop by the large hall where the old black grand piano stood. It was a beautiful instrument, its surface polished so often that it reflected the dim ceiling lights like still water. She would wipe away the dust, then stand for a moment staring at the keys. Her hands would hover above them, trembling slightly. Sometimes, unable to resist, she pressed one key softly, then another, until a quiet tune filled the empty hall. Those moments were her secret. The world didn't know that Lena had once loved the piano more than anything. As a child, she had spent hours practicing on a small upright piano in her home, her fingers dancing over the keys while her parents listened proudly. She dreamed of becoming a performer one day, of playing in halls filled with people who would feel her music deep inside their hearts. But life had its own plans. When she grew older, her family went through hard times. Her father lost his job, her mother fell ill, and money became scarce. The piano lessons stopped. Eventually, the piano itself had to be sold. Lena remembered watching two men carry it out of their small home, while she stood silently at the door, clutching her hands so tightly that her nails left marks on her palms. That day, she promised herself she would one day return to music, but years passed, and that promise faded into the noise of survival. Now, she worked in the conservatory where others lived the dream she had once carried. Every day, she watched students rush into practice rooms, their laughter echoing through the hallways. She didn't envy them. She simply admired them. There was something comforting about being close to music again, even if only as a cleaner. The sound of the piano still reached her heart in the same way it always had. One cold winter morning, as she was wiping the floor near one of the classrooms, a door opened suddenly. A young student, clearly in a hurry, almost bumped into her. "Sorry," he muttered before rushing down the corridor with his sheet music. Lena smiled faintly and went back to work. A moment later, she heard someone playing inside the room, the same student struggling through a difficult piece. The note stumbled and stopped halfway. She paused, listening carefully, almost whispering the right notes in her mind as if she could help him find the rhythm. But she didn't. She simply smiled again, finished cleaning, and moved on. Lena had been working at the conservatory for 5 years. She was quiet, polite, and never complained no matter how heavy her workload became. The staff liked her because she was reliable. The students hardly noticed her. Sometimes a few would greet her kindly, but most just walked past without a word, and she didn't mind. She found peace in her silence. Cleaning the music rooms, arranging the chairs, and keeping the pianos polished made her feel useful. It also allowed her to stay close to the things she loved most: music. Every once in a while, she would stop near a classroom when no one was around and let her fingers drift over the keys. Just for a few seconds. The feeling of the smooth ivory beneath her skin was like touching an old memory. She never played for long. She was afraid someone might see her and misunderstand. After all, she was just the janitor. People might think she was being careless with the instruments, so she kept her secret carefully hidden in those quiet moments after everyone left. There was something special about how she listened to music, though. When others heard a melody, she felt it, every note, every pause. It wasn't just sound to her. It was emotion, a language that spoke directly to her soul. That's why, even though her life had taken her far from the dreams of her youth, she never truly stopped being a musician inside. One night, after a long day of cleaning, She found herself standing again by the grand piano in the main hall. The place was dark except for a single lamp glowing near the stage. Outside, snow was falling softly against the windows. She hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the bench. Her hands rested on the keys, her reflection faint in the glossy surface. She took a deep breath and began to play a simple tune she had learned when she was little. The sound was soft at first, almost uncertain, but as the notes flowed, her fingers moved more confidently. The melody filled the empty hall, gentle yet full of emotion. It told stories of loss, of love, of dreams buried but not forgotten. Her eyes closed, and for a few precious minutes, Lena was no longer a janitor. She was a pianist again, pouring her heart into the music. When she stopped, she stayed still for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. It was almost as beautiful as the sound itself. Then she smiled sadly, stood up, and quietly returned to her cleaning. She didn't notice that someone had passed by the open doorway, a young student who had forgotten his bag. He had stopped, listened, and stood frozen in place, surprised by the beauty of what he'd heard. But Lena didn't know. She never imagined anyone would be there. The next morning came with the usual rush of students and teachers. No one spoke of the music that echoed late in the night. Lena carried her mop and bucket through the corridors, as always. The student who had heard her wanted to say something but decided not to. Maybe he thought he had imagined it. Maybe he didn't want to embarrass her. So the secret stayed hers, for now. That same morning, news spread that a new piano instructor would be joining the conservatory. His name was Mr. Alden, a man known for his strictness and his high standards. People whispered that he once taught at a royal academy, and that he didn't tolerate mistakes or mediocrity. He was the kind of teacher who could make or break a student's confidence. Lena heard his name mentioned by the staff while cleaning the teacher's lounge. She didn't pay much attention, though. New teachers came and went. What mattered to her was keeping her work spotless and finishing on time. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Later that afternoon, while cleaning one of the empty rooms, Lena noticed the piano was covered in a thin layer of dust. She decided to clean it properly before the new instructor arrived. As she polished the surface, her hand brushed against the keys, producing a soft sound. Instinctively, she pressed a few more keys, trying a small tune just to test the tone. The sound was sweet, and she smiled without realizing it. Her fingers moved a little more freely now, lost in memory. Then suddenly, a sharp voice broke the silence. "What do you think you're doing?" Lena froze. Standing at the doorway was a tall man in a dark suit, Mr. Alden himself. His expression was cold, his eyebrows drawn tightly together. "This is not your instrument to play," he said harshly. "You are supposed to clean, not touch the piano. These are for trained musicians, not staff." His words stung. Lena quickly stood up, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I was just what?" he interrupted. "Testing your curiosity? This isn't a playground. Leave the piano alone and get back to your duties." For a moment, she wanted to explain. She wanted to tell him she understood music more deeply than he could imagine, but she didn't. She simply nodded, whispered, "Yes, sir," and quietly stepped away. Mr. Alden watched her go, his expression still cold. To him, she was just a cleaner who overstepped her place. But if he had looked closely, he might have noticed the sadness in her eyes, or the quiet strength behind it. As the day went on, Lena returned to her work as if nothing had happened. But inside, something stirred. The sound of those few notes she had played still echoed in her mind. She didn't know it yet, but the day she was scolded by the new instructor was also the day her hidden talent began to find its way back into the world. The next few days at the conservatory were busy. The arrival of Mr. Alden had everyone on edge. He had a reputation for being demanding and sharp-tongued, and the students were already whispering stories about his strict teaching methods. Some said he could tell within a minute if someone had real talent or not. Others claimed he once made a student cry just for missing a single note. To Lena, he was just another instructor. One more person she'd see passing through the hallways while she went about her cleaning. But ever since he had scolded her, she tried to avoid the rooms where he taught. She didn't want to get in his way again. The memory of his cold eyes and sharp tone still lingered in her mind, making her chest tighten whenever she passed the music wing. Mr. Alden, on the other hand, had quickly made himself known. His teaching style was as people had described, firm, precise, and without patience for mistakes. During lessons, he paced the room like a conductor ready to strike at the first wrong note. He demanded excellence, and though his students respected him, they also feared him. In his view, music was a discipline, not a passion. Emotion, he believed, came after perfection. To him, music had to be clean, precise, and powerful. Anything less was a waste of time. One afternoon, while students were practicing for an upcoming recital, Lena was cleaning near the main hall. She could hear Mr. Alden's voice echoing from one of the rooms. "Again," he said sharply. "You're pressing the keys like you're afraid of them. Music doesn't respond to fear. Play it with control." The student nervously began again, her hands trembling slightly. The note stumbled, and Mr. Alden sighed loudly. "Stop. If you can't feel the rhythm, you can't play it. Come back tomorrow and practice properly." Lena paused in the hallway, quietly listening. There was something about his tone that made her uncomfortable. He spoke like music was a contest to be won, not a story to be told. She remembered how her first teacher used to tell her, "Don't fight the piano. Let it speak through you." She missed that kind of kindness, the kind that let music live inside a person rather than forcing it out of them. When the lesson ended, Mr. Alden stepped out of the room, rubbing his temples. He noticed Lena nearby, sweeping the floor quietly. Their eyes met for a brief second before she quickly looked away. He frowned slightly. "You again," he said. "Are you assigned to this wing now?" "Yes, sir," she replied softly. "Just cleaning the corridor." He nodded stiffly. "Be careful not to touch any instruments this time. They're fragile and expensive." "I understand," she said, her voice calm but distant. He walked away without another word, and she returned to sweeping. But inside, his words stung again. Not because they were harsh, but because they carried an assumption. To him, she was invisible, incapable of understanding what music truly meant. If only he knew how deeply it once lived in her heart. The next morning, the conservatory was hosting a rehearsal for visiting guests, patrons who donated funds to support the music programs. It was an important event, and everyone was expected to be on their best behavior. Lena came early to make sure the main hall was spotless. She polished the piano, arranged the chairs neatly, and checked that every corner gleamed. While she was cleaning, Mr. Alden walked in with a group of students. He was instructing them about posture and performance, his voice echoing through the empty hall. Lena quietly worked near the side, trying not to draw attention. Then one of the students asked nervously, "Sir, the left pedal isn't working properly. It feels stiff." Mr. Alden frowned and leaned over the piano, testing it himself. "You're right," he muttered. "It might be jammed." Lena, who had some knowledge of pianos from her younger days, stepped forward gently. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. "If it's just stiff, sometimes there's dust or moisture inside the pedal frame. I can check if you'd like." Before she could finish, Mr. Alden cut her off. "No, thank you," he said firmly. "We'll have the technicians handle it. Please stick to your work. This isn't your concern." A few of the students exchanged uncomfortable glances. Lena's face flushed with embarrassment, but she simply nodded and stepped back. She wanted to explain that she had repaired small pianos before, that she knew how the mechanism worked, but she stayed silent. There was no point in arguing. When the rehearsal began, Lena moved to the back of the hall and continued wiping the railings, pretending not to listen. But she couldn't help hearing every note. The students played well, but there was something missing, something small yet noticeable. The sound was correct, the rhythm perfect, but the feeling wasn't there. It sounded like a performance, not a story. Mr. Alden seemed pleased, though. He nodded approvingly after each student finished, offering brief comments like, "Good control" or "better tempo." For him, that was praise enough. When the rehearsal ended, the students gathered their things and left. Mr. Alden stayed behind, reviewing his notes. Lena quietly approached to collect the used cups and tissues left on the chairs. As she passed by the piano, she noticed that the soft pedal was still jammed. Without thinking much, she knelt down to check it. She pressed it gently, and after a few careful movements, the mechanism clicked softly into place. She smiled faintly, satisfied, and stood up. But when she turned, she realized Mr. Alden was watching her. "What are you doing?" he asked sharply. She hesitated. "I was just checking the pedal." "It's working now," she said quietly. He walked over, testing it himself. It worked perfectly. Still, instead of thanking her, he frowned. You shouldn't interfere with instruments. If something had broken, you'd be responsible. Please remember your duties and leave the instruments to the professionals." His tone was calm but cold. Lena bowed her head slightly. "Yes, sir," she said. Then she picked up her cleaning cloth and walked away slowly. That night, after everyone had gone, she returned to the hall once more. She sat at the same piano and touched the keys gently, like greeting an old friend. She didn't play much, just a few chords, soft and simple. But the sound filled the hall with warmth, a kind of beauty that didn't need to be perfect. She didn't know that someone else was there. One of the students, a boy named Tom, had forgotten his phone and returned quietly to get it. He stood near the doorway watching her in silence. The way she played was different from what he was used to hearing in class. There was no tension, no competition, just emotion. It felt alive. When she finished, she sighed softly, stood up and began wiping the piano as usual. Tom slipped away silently, his heart strangely moved. The next morning, during a lesson, Tom couldn't focus. His mind kept going back to the melody he'd heard the night before. During a break, he whispered to another student, "You won't believe what I heard yesterday." The janitor was playing the piano. She was incredible, his friend laughed. "The janitor? You're kidding." "I'm serious," Tom said. "It wasn't like anything we play here." It sounded real. Within a few hours, the story spread among the students. Some thought it was a joke, others were curious, but no one dared to ask Lena directly. She continued her work quietly, unaware that whispers about her were circulating through the halls. Even Mr. Alden heard about it later that day. One of his students mentioned it during practice. "Sir, is it true the janitor plays the piano?" Mr. Alden raised an eyebrow. "Who told you that?" "Everyone's talking about it," the student said. "They say she played last night and it was beautiful." He frowned slightly. "I highly doubt that. Let's not waste time on gossip. Focus on your music." But later that evening, while walking through the empty corridor, he paused near the main hall. From inside, he could hear faint notes drifting through the air, soft, slow, and filled with emotion. He recognized the sound of the piano and stepped closer, curiosity getting the better of him. Through the slightly open door, he saw her sitting there, the janitor, the same woman he had scolded twice. Her hands moved gracefully over the keys, her eyes closed, her expression calm. The music was gentle but powerful, filled with a kind of sorrow that no trained student had ever captured. He stood there silently for a few moments, his pride battling with his surprise. When she stopped and looked up, he quickly stepped back, pretending he hadn't been there. He walked away down the hall, his thoughts heavy. That night, Mr. Alden didn't sleep easily. For the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong about her, and about what truly made someone a musician. The following week at the conservatory began like any other, but something small had started to stir beneath the surface. Whispers filled the hallways, quiet conversations near lockers, and curious glances toward the woman in the gray uniform who quietly swept the floors. Everyone was talking about the same thing, the janitor who could play the piano. At first, it was just a rumor. Students shared it half-jokingly between classes, saying they had heard someone playing late at night and that the music was unlike anything they'd ever heard before. A few laughed, others shrugged it off, but curiosity has a way of spreading faster than the truth itself. By the middle of the week, even some teachers had heard the story. One of them asked the night guard if it was true. The guard hesitated, then nodded slowly. "She doesn't know anyone hears her," he said quietly. "Sometimes after cleaning, she plays a little. Not loud, just enough to fill the hall. I never wanted to stop her. It's beautiful, like she's talking to someone who isn't there." Those words made their way around the building, and soon more people started to believe the rumor might actually be true. Lena, however, knew nothing about this. She went on with her days as she always had, polishing floors, cleaning practice rooms, arranging chairs, and keeping to herself. She had no idea her quiet, private moments at the piano had caught anyone's attention, but the students had grown too curious. One evening, a small group of them decided to stay behind after classes. They pretended to leave, then quietly slipped back into the main hall and hid behind the curtains on the upper balcony. They waited there in the dark, whispering to each other nervously. "I told you she comes around this time," one of them said. "Are you sure? What if we get caught?" Another whispered. "Just be quiet," came the reply. Minutes passed. The hall was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then they heard the sound of soft footsteps and the squeak of a cleaning cart being rolled across the floor. They peeked through the curtains and saw her, Lena, moving slowly across the stage, wiping dust from the piano. After finishing, she stood still for a moment, looking at the keys. The students held their breath. Then she sat down. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly, and then the first notes began. The sound was gentle at first, then deeper, richer. The melody flowed like a quiet stream turning into a river. Every note carried feeling, sadness, hope, peace, and all wrapped together. The students stared silently, wide-eyed. None of them had ever heard a performance like that, not even from the best students at the conservatory. It wasn't about skill. It was about soul. When she finished, the hall stayed quiet. The students didn't dare move until she left the stage, softly pushing her cart toward the door. Once she was gone, they looked at each other in disbelief. That was her, one finally whispered. It can't be, another said, still in awe. She played like she was born for it. One of them had secretly recorded a short video clip on his phone, just 30 seconds long, but enough to capture the melody and the sight of her sitting at the piano under the dim lights. The next morning, that clip spread like wildfire among the students. It wasn't uploaded publicly, but everyone shared it privately through messages. They replayed it again and again, amazed that the quiet janitor they passed every day could create something so moving. When the clip finally reached the director's office, he was sitting with one of the senior teachers. The director played it on his phone, frowning thoughtfully as the music filled the room. "That's her?" he asked. "Yes," the teacher replied. "That's Lena. She's been working here for years." The director listened until the end, then leaned back in his chair. "That's no amateur," he said quietly. "Who taught her?" "No one knows, but maybe someone should ask." Later that afternoon, Mr. Alden was in his classroom, reviewing sheet music when a few students entered. They were unusually quiet, and one of them finally spoke up. "Sir, have you seen the video?" He looked up, puzzled. "What video?" "The janitor," the student said carefully. "She was playing the piano. Someone recorded her." Mr. Alden frowned. "I don't have time for jokes." "It's not a joke," the student said. "You should listen to it." With a sigh, Mr. Alden accepted the phone they offered and pressed play. The moment the music began, he froze. The sound that came from the small speaker was full of warmth and sorrow, perfectly balanced, every note deliberate and alive. It wasn't technical perfection that struck him. It was emotion, real raw emotion, the kind he often told his students they were missing. When the clip ended, he handed the phone back wordlessly. "That could be anyone," he said stiffly. But inside, he knew exactly whose playing it was. He had heard that same touch once before. That night he had stood by the door listening from the shadows. That evening, when everyone had gone home, Mr. Alden found himself walking toward the main hall again. The place was empty, quiet, the air slightly cool. The piano stood in the middle of the stage, polished and waiting. He sat on one of the chairs and stared at it for a long moment. He couldn't stop thinking about what he'd heard, both in the video and that night. How could someone who worked as a janitor play with such depth? How had she learned to express such emotion without formal training? It troubled him, not because he was angry, but because it challenged everything he believed. For years he had told his students that discipline and structure were the only paths to mastery, but that music, her music, was proof of something different, something deeper. He stayed there for a long while before quietly leaving. The next morning, when Lena came in to clean, she noticed people glancing at her more than usual. Some smiled kindly, others simply stared. A few whispered as she passed, but she didn't understand why. Then, as she was cleaning near the cafeteria, one of the younger students approached her shyly. "Excuse me," he said, I just wanted to say that your music was beautiful." She looked at him, confused. "My music?" He smiled nervously. "Yes, the piece you played the other night. Everyone's been talking about it." Lena froze. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. "You heard that?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "It was amazing. I didn't even know someone could play like that." Her face turned red with embarrassment. "I didn't mean for anyone to hear," she said softly. "It was just a moment." "I shouldn't have—" "No!" he interrupted quickly. "Please don't say that. You made us all feel something. We always try to play the right notes, but you played something real." Lena didn't know how to respond. She smiled faintly, thanked him, and went back to her work, but her mind was spinning. She couldn't believe her private playing had become a topic of discussion. Later that day, the conservatory director called her to his office. She entered nervously, unsure why she was being summoned. He greeted her with a warm smile. "Lena, please sit down." She sat quietly, her hands folded on her lap. "I saw a video of you playing," he said gently. "It was remarkable. You have a real gift." Her eyes widened. "Oh, sir, I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I was just cleaning and—" "You didn't cause trouble," he interrupted kindly. "You reminded us all what music truly is. Would you consider playing at one of our small gatherings? Nothing formal, just for the staff and students." "It would mean a lot." Lena's heart raced. She shook her head quickly. "Oh, no, sir. I couldn't. I haven't performed in years. I'm just a janitor," the director finished softly. "Titles don't matter here, Lena. Music doesn't belong only to professionals. It belongs to those who feel it." She didn't know what to say. Her eyes filled with tears and she looked down. "Thank you, sir. But I'm not ready," she whispered. He nodded understandingly. "That's all right. Think about it." As she left the office, she caught sight of Mr. Alden standing in the hallway. Their eyes met briefly. He didn't say a word, but there was something different in his expression. Not pride, not annoyance, but something quieter, more thoughtful. That night, when she returned to the empty hall, she didn't play. She simply stood near the piano, staring at it. For the first time in many years, she wasn't alone with her music anymore. The world had heard her, and it had listened, but deep inside she also felt a small fear. She had never meant to draw attention. Her music had been her secret, a quiet escape from the noise of life. Now it was something people wanted from her. As the clock struck 9, she turned off the lights and left the hall, unaware that her life at the conservatory was about to change in a way she could never have imagined. Because in just a few days, that janitor's performance would be the talk of the entire conservatory. And Mr. Alden, the man who once told her to stick to cleaning, would be forced to face a truth he had long ignored. The video of Lena's late-night piano playing had spread quietly through the conservatory. No one expected it to go beyond the small circle of students, but the clip had touched hearts. There was something about the way her fingers moved, the way her music seemed to breathe with emotion that made people stop and listen. Soon, even teachers had seen it, though most dismissed it as a rumor blown out of proportion. Mr. Alden, the piano instructor, was one of them. When a student mentioned the janitor's video, he smirked and said, "You all are too easily impressed. Anyone can play a few notes and look emotional. That doesn't make her a musician." His tone was sharp, his pride untouchable. But the conservatory's director thought differently. He had seen the clip and watched it twice, maybe 3 times. There was something real there, something raw and pure. He couldn't stop thinking about it. So one morning, during a staff meeting, he mentioned it. "Have any of you seen the janitor's performance?" he asked casually. The room fell quiet. A few instructors exchanged glances but stayed silent. Alden finally spoke. "Director, with all due respect, I hope we are not comparing a janitor's pastime with trained artists. This is a conservatory, not a cafe." The director didn't argue. He simply said, "Sometimes genius hides in unlikely places. I'd like to see her play in person." And with that, the matter was settled. That same afternoon, Lena was called to the director's office. She came in, holding her mop, her hands slightly damp, unsure why she was being summoned. The director gave her a kind smile. "Please, sit down," he said. Lena hesitated, then sat carefully on the edge of the chair. "I've seen a video of you playing the piano," the director began. "It was, quite something. You have a gift, Lena, a very rare one." Her face turned pale. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly. "That was just something I do sometimes after cleaning. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." "There's no trouble," he assured her gently. "In fact, I'd like you to play at our upcoming student gathering. It's a small event, mostly students and faculty. Would you consider it?" Lena's eyes widened. She shook her head instantly. "Oh, no, sir. That's not possible. I'm just the janitor. They wouldn't want to see me play. It would only make things uncomfortable." The director leaned forward. "Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected hands. I believe everyone deserves a chance to be heard." She was silent. She didn't know how to refuse politely. The thought of playing in front of the same people who saw her as invisible made her heart race. She wanted to disappear into her work, to go back to the comfort of her quiet nights. "I appreciate your kindness, sir," she whispered, "but I'm not sure I can." "Just think about it," he said softly. "If you change your mind, my door is open." When she left his office, her heart was heavy. She went back to mopping the hallway, her mind spinning. A few students passed by and smiled at her. Something unusual. She could tell they knew. The rumor had already spread. That night, as she cleaned the main hall, a small group of students approached her. They were nervous but excited. One of them said, "Ma'am, we saw your video. It was incredible. You really should perform. People need to hear you." She smiled faintly and shook her head. "It's kind of you, but I'm not meant for that stage. I'm happy just cleaning around it." Another student said, "But that stage needs someone like you. You play with heart. That's something most of us are still trying to learn." Their words stayed with her long after they left. Days passed and the upcoming event drew closer. Posters went up, lights were checked, and the halls buzzed with energy. Everyone was talking about performances, outfits, and schedules. And among all that chatter, Lena's name began to appear, whispered, curious, unsure. When Mr. Alden heard that Lena was on the performance list, his temper flared. He stormed into the director's office, his voice sharp with disbelief. "You can't be serious," he said. "A janitor playing at the student recital? This is a conservatory of excellence. What will people think?" The director stayed calm. "People will think we value music and not status." "She's not trained," Alden argued. "This is humiliating for our students. You're turning the event into a spectacle." "I've heard her play," the director said simply. "You haven't. When you do, then we can talk." Alden clenched his jaw. He was not used to being overruled. "Fine," he said finally. "But when this goes wrong, remember I warned you." Word of Alden's anger spread quickly. Some students agreed with him. They said it was unfair that she wasn't a professional. Others said they were curious. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Meanwhile, Lena spent her evenings sitting by the piano after cleaning, her hands trembling as she touched the keys. She didn't practice complicated pieces. She just played what came from her heart, soft, flowing melodies that told her story without words. The janitor who had lost her dream years ago found it quietly returning, note by note, but fear held her back. She remembered the day Alden scolded her in front of everyone. His words had cut deep, reminding her of everything she had lost. She didn't want to be laughed at again. She didn't want pity. She wanted to stay invisible, safe within the quiet corners of her work. The night before the event, she almost went to the director to withdraw. She even wrote a small note saying she couldn't perform, but something stopped her. She thought of her late husband, who used to tell her, "You were born to make music. Don't let anyone silence that." She folded the note and tore it apart. The next morning, the entire conservatory was decorated for the event. The grand hall gleamed. Students moved in and out, checking lights, testing microphones. Lena moved quietly in the background, mopping the floor as she always did. But this time, everyone seemed to look at her differently. Some smiled politely, some avoided her eyes, some whispered behind her back. When the event began, one performance followed another, cheerful, practiced, and polished. Students played classical pieces, duets, and even a few modern compositions. Then, near the end of the schedule, the director stepped onto the stage and said, "Before we close, we have one more performance, a special one. Please welcome someone who reminds us that music belongs to everyone, Lena." The room fell silent. Some students exchanged puzzled looks. A few clapped politely. Mr. Alden sat stiffly in the front row, his arms folded, his face expressionless. Lena walked onto the stage slowly, her simple uniform still on, her hair tied neatly. The stage lights seemed too bright. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. She looked out at the audience, rows of faces, some curious, some doubtful. She bowed slightly, then sat at the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. Then she began to play. The first few notes were soft, almost hesitant, but soon they flowed with warmth and power. It wasn't a famous piece. It was something she had made herself, something that carried her memories, her struggles, her love, and her quiet sorrow. The melody rose and fell like a story told without words. The room grew still. Even the air seemed to pause. By the time the final note faded, there was not a sound, not even a whisper. Then slowly, applause began. Quiet at first, then louder until the whole hall was filled with it. Some students were on their feet. A few had tears in their eyes. Mr. Alden sat frozen, his proud expression gone. For the first time in years, he was speechless. He knew what he had just heard wasn't just music. It was truth. Lena stood, bowed once more, and quietly stepped off the stage. She didn't wait for compliments or praise. She just smiled softly, as if a heavy weight had finally lifted from her shoulders. Behind her, the applause continued, and somewhere in the crowd, the director leaned toward Mr. Alden and whispered, "Still think she doesn't belong on that stage?" Alden said nothing. He just looked down, ashamed and thoughtful. For the first time, he realized that the janitor he had dismissed had something he had long forgotten, the soul of true music. The applause that filled the hall after Lena's performance seemed endless. For a few seconds, she didn't even move. She just sat there quietly, her fingers still resting on the piano keys, her heart pounding as if it couldn't believe what had just happened. She had expected silence, maybe a few polite claps, but instead the whole room was standing. She looked up and saw faces filled with awe, some even with tears. Students who had once laughed behind her back were now clapping with genuine admiration. Teachers who had ignored her looked stunned, as though they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Lena gave a small, humble bow and started to step away from the piano. But before she could leave, the director stood up and said loudly, "One more, please. Just one more piece." The audience cheered in agreement. Lena froze for a moment, her eyes wide. She hadn't prepared for this. She hadn't planned to play anything else. But then, as she looked around the hall, at the students, at the piano she loved, and even at the instructor who had once mocked her, she felt a calmness come over her. She nodded gently and sat back down. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the keys again. Then she began to play. This time the music was different, softer, deeper, like a quiet conversation between her heart and the instrument. The notes were slower, more emotional. They spoke of memories, of nights spent cleaning the hall in silence, of dreams that had been buried under years of hardship. Every sound carried a piece of her life, the pain, the loss, and the quiet strength she had found through it all. The audience listened without breathing. Even the air in the hall felt heavy with emotion. It was as if her music was pulling something out of everyone, a reminder of their own forgotten dreams, their own quiet struggles. When the final note faded, there was silence again. No one moved. Then slowly, applause began once more, but this time it wasn't loud or wild. It was gentle, heartfelt, filled with respect. Lena stood up, bowed deeply, and smiled softly. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her music had said everything. As she stepped off the stage, the director approached her, his eyes shining. "That was extraordinary," he said. "You've given us something we'll never forget." She lowered her head shyly. "Thank you, sir. I'm glad they liked it." "They didn't just like it," he said with a smile. "They felt it." Behind him, Mr. Alden was still sitting in the front row, staring at the piano, as if he couldn't quite understand what had just happened. His expression had softened. The pride and arrogance that usually surrounded him were gone. He finally stood up and walked toward Lena. For a moment, the crowd watched in silence. Everyone knew what had happened between them weeks ago, how he had humiliated her in front of students. No one knew what he would say now. He stopped in front of her and took a deep breath. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, came out quiet. "I was wrong," he said. "I judged you without knowing you, without even listening." Lena looked at him gently. "It's all right," she said. "Sometimes we don't see people until they do something that surprises us." Alden nodded slowly. "You didn't just surprise me. You reminded me why I started teaching music in the first place." His eyes glistened slightly, though he tried to hide it. "Would you consider helping me with the students?" he asked. "You have something they need to learn, not about notes or rhythm, but about feeling." Lena blinked, taken aback. "Me? I'm not a teacher." "You are," he said simply. "You just don't have a classroom." The director smiled proudly. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he added. "We could use someone who understands music the way you do." Lena hesitated. The thought of standing in front of students as anything more than a cleaner felt unreal. But as she looked around, at the faces now filled with warmth and respect, she realized something had changed. She was no longer invisible here. "I don't know if I can teach," she said softly, "but I can share what I've learned." "That's all teaching really is," Alden replied. The crowd, still gathered near the stage, broke into another round of applause. This time it wasn't for a performance. It was for a woman who had reminded them all what true passion looked like. After the event ended, the conservatory buzzed with conversation. Everywhere Lena went, people greeted her. Students thanked her, teachers smiled at her, even the cafeteria staff congratulated her. It felt strange but warm. For so long she had walked through these halls unnoticed, carrying her mop and bucket while others hurried past. Now every face she passed seemed to know her. Later that evening, when everyone had gone, Lena stayed behind to clean the hall. Old habits never left easily. The stage lights were dim now, the piano sitting silently in the center. She walked toward it and gently ran her fingers over the keys once more. "You did well," a familiar voice said from behind. It was Alden again, his tone no longer condescending. "You're still here?" she asked. He nodded. "I couldn't leave without thanking you properly. What you did today, it changed something in this place." "In me too," she smiled softly. "Music can do that." He looked at her for a moment and said, "You know, when I first started teaching, I believed skill was everything. Technique, perfection, control. But after watching you play, I realized I've been wrong for years. The greatest players aren't the ones who play perfectly. They're the ones who make people feel something." Lena's eyes softened. "Maybe we both learned something today," she said. "You reminded me that music still lives in me, even after all this time." They both stood there quietly for a while, the empty hall filled with a peaceful silence. Before leaving, Alden said, "From tomorrow, come to my class. Not as a janitor. As my assistant." She blinked in surprise. "Are you sure?" "More than ever," he said. "You'll help me teach students how to listen. Really listen. They'll learn more from you in 1 week than they have from me in a year." Lena didn't know what to say. She just nodded, her heart full. When he left, she sat at the piano again, alone under the soft light. Her hands rested on the keys and she began to play one last piece. Something gentle, hopeful. The sound floated through the empty room like a quiet promise. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a forgotten cleaner or a lost musician. She felt whole again, like the two parts of her life had finally come together. The next day, word spread that the janitor who had stunned everyone was joining the piano department as an assistant. Some people were surprised, others delighted. Students came early to meet her. They wanted to know how she played with such feeling, how she made music sound alive. She didn't give them long lectures or big lessons. She just said, "Play what you feel. Don't just press keys. Tell your story." And as days went by, something magical happened. The students began to change. Their music grew warmer, more personal. Even Alden's own teaching softened. He started focusing more on emotion than perfection. In quiet moments, he would glance at Lena as she listened to the students, her eyes closed, her hands folded gently. He realized that the janitor he once insulted had become the heart of the conservatory. Weeks later, during another recital, a student performed a piece inspired by Lena's story. When they finished, they dedicated it to the woman who reminded us that music is meant to be felt, not just heard. Lena stood in the audience, her eyes shining. She didn't crave recognition or applause. Just knowing her music had touched others was enough. As the night ended, she stepped outside into the cool air. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and she could still hear faint echoes of piano notes behind her. She smiled quietly, whispering to herself, it was never too late. For years, she had believed her dream was gone forever. But that night proved something. That talent never truly fades, it only waits for the right moment to be rediscovered. And for Lena, that moment had finally come. Days passed, and the conservatory slowly returned to its normal rhythm. But something inside those old walls had changed. The students now played their music differently, softer, more heartfelt, as if they were trying to capture a piece of what Lena had shared with them that night. Even the sound of piano practice that used to echo down the hallways now carried a warmth it didn't have before. Lena still arrived early every morning, carrying her mop and cleaning tools as she always did. But now her role was more than that. After finishing her cleaning, she would quietly walk to the piano classrooms where Mr. Alden was teaching. He would smile and gesture for her to sit near the students. And together, they would guide the young musician. He on technique, she on emotion. The students loved her presence. When she spoke, she didn't use complex musical terms or heavy words. She would say things like, "Don't fight the piano, talk to it," or "Let your fingers breathe with the music." Simple words, but they carried a meaning that stayed in their hearts. One afternoon, as she listened to a nervous student struggling with a piece, Lena gently placed her hand on the piano and said, "Close your eyes. Forget the audience. Forget the notes. Just remember something you love, and let that feeling flow into your hands." The student followed her advice, and the sound changed instantly. It became tender and real. Alden stood silently in the corner, amazed. Later, he told her, "I could teach for another 20 years and still not explain what you just showed them in one sentence." Lena laughed softly. "Maybe that's because I don't try to explain it," she said. "I just feel it." Alden smiled and shook his head. "You remind me why I chose this path. I think I forgot that somewhere along the way." Their friendship grew quietly from that point. There was no grand announcement or formality. It was built through shared moments, late afternoons spent discussing music, evenings sitting in the hall listening to students practice. He would sometimes ask her opinion on a performance, and she would give honest but kind feedback. Over time, word of Lena's story spread beyond the conservatory. A few local journalists came to interview her, but she politely declined every time. She said she didn't want fame. "I'm just grateful to be around music again," she told them. "That's enough for me." Her humility touched everyone. The students started calling her Aunt Lena affectionately. Whenever they felt discouraged, they would find her, and she would always have something comforting to say. "You don't need to be the best," she'd tell them. "You just need to be true to what you play." Months went by, and the conservatory began to feel different, brighter, more human. Even the cleaning staff seemed happier because of how Lena treated them. She always stopped to talk, shared her lunch, and listened to their stories. To her, no one was beneath anyone. One day, the director called her to his office again. "Lena," he said with a kind smile, "we'd like to offer you an official position as an emotional expression coach. It won't affect your current job if you wish to keep it, but we want your name listed among our teaching staff." Lena's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he said warmly. "You've earned it." She nodded, overwhelmed. She couldn't believe that the same woman who once wiped the piano keys was now being honored for her music. But deep down, she knew it wasn't about titles. What mattered most was that she was finally doing what she loved again, sharing the soul of music with others. The news spread quickly. When the next recital came around, Lena was invited to play again. This time, not as a surprise, but as the guest of honor. The students prepared special performances inspired by her journey. The hall was filled with anticipation. When Lena walked onto the stage, the audience stood and applauded before she even touched the piano. She smiled humbly, waved slightly, and sat down. She looked at the piano lovingly, her reflection shimmering on its polished surface. Then she began to play. This time, her music carried joy. It was lighter, brighter, a celebration of everything that had changed. Each note seemed to say, "It's never too late to start again." The melody danced through the hall, reaching every corner, touching every heart. As she played, Alden watched from the front row. He couldn't help but think back to the first day he met her, how blind he had been, how quickly he had judged. His chest tightened with emotion. He thought of how much he had learned from her, not just about music, but about humility. When the final note faded, the audience rose to their feet again. The applause was thunderous, but Lena didn't bask in it. She stood quietly, bowed, and said softly, "Thank you for letting me share a little part of myself." After the recital, Alden approached her backstage. He held a small bouquet of white flowers. "For you," he said. "You deserve these and much more." She accepted them with a gentle smile. "Thank you, but you know I don't play for applause or flowers." "I know," he said with a laugh. "You play because your heart tells you to. That's what makes it so powerful." There was a pause before he added, "I also wanted to tell you something else. I've been offered a teaching position abroad. I'll be leaving soon." Lena blinked in surprise. "You're leaving?" He nodded. Yes, but before I go, I wanted you to know how much you've changed me. I used to think music was about control. You showed me it's about release. You reminded me that every note should mean something. Her eyes softened. I should be the one thanking you. You gave me a second chance, he smiled. No, Lena, you gave yourself that chance. I only watched. They shared a quiet moment of understanding. Two people who had crossed paths by accident, only to change each other's lives forever. A few weeks later, when Alden left, the students gave him a farewell party. Lena played one last piece for him, a simple melody that spoke of goodbye and gratitude. He listened silently, then left with tears in his eyes. Time moved on. Seasons changed. Lena continued to teach, clean, and play. She became part of the conservatory's soul, not just as a teacher, but as a symbol of resilience. Whenever a new student joined, someone would eventually tell them the story of the janitor who once amazed the entire school. Years later, when the conservatory held its annual music festival, the director gave a small speech. He said, "We once had a woman here who reminded us that greatness doesn't wear a title. She taught us that true music isn't learned, it's felt. Her name was Lena." The audience clapped, and a few students who had learned from her smiled proudly. She had retired by then, living quietly in a small house nearby, but she still visited the conservatory sometimes, walking through the halls where her journey had begun. One evening, long after the students had gone, she sat alone in the empty hall again. Dust particles floated in the golden light coming through the windows. She touched the piano keys softly and played the same tune she had once played that night years ago, the one that had changed everything. Her hands were slower now, but the feeling was still there, deep and alive. And as the notes echoed softly through the quiet hall, she smiled. She remembered every face, every moment, every lesson learned. She whispered to herself, it was worth it. Every bit of it. The janitor who once played in secret had become a teacher, a guide, and an inspiration. Her story was no longer hidden in the shadows of the conservatory. It lived on in every note that was played there. And long after the last sound faded, the memory of her music remained. Gentle, timeless, and full of heart, because in the end, Lena had proved something no one in that grand building could ever forget. True talent doesn't demand attention. It shines quietly with grace, and when the world finally listens, it realizes that greatness can come from the humblest hands.